Let me take a sip from my cup of tea, and I will tell you what happened 2 years back with me.
I sit here in my old rocking chair, the one my husband once carved for me decades ago, its wood polished smooth by years of use, the creaks now familiar companions to my thoughts. The sunlight filters through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the floor, dancing like memories I can no longer hold in my hands. My hands, oh, my hands have grown gnarled and veined with age, the skin thin, tremors betraying the years I've carried. But these hands, these same hands, once held the weight of dreams, love, and a life I thought would be eternal. My name is Eleanor Rose, though most people now simply call me Mrs. Rose. And as I sit here in the quiet of my home, I realize that this is the perfect moment to tell my story, the story of love, betrayal, and ultimately justice. A story that perhaps begins like many others, but spirals into the dark corners of human deception I never imagined at this age. You see, people often think betrayal is the domain of the young, the naive, the inexperienced. They imagine a woman discovering a lover's infidelity in the blush of her 20s or 30s, the drama steeped in fiery heartbreak. But no, betrayal has no age limit. It can creep into your life when you have grown gray hairs, when your skin has wrinkled, when society assumes you have grown too old to feel hurt, too old to crave love. I am here to tell you, betrayal does not respect age, nor does it care for the years we've lived with devotion. I met Henry Rose when I was a girl with dreams as bright as the spring sun. We were young, reckless, and utterly devoted to each other. I remember his laughter, the way it could fill a room and leave me gasping for breath, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled at me. We built a life together, a home, children, a career, countless memories that became the threads of our shared tapestry. And I believed, oh, how foolishly I believed, that this life, this man, this love would never falter. The years passed with a rhythm both comforting and predictable. We settled into routines, each day blurring into the next. Our home became a sanctuary, filled with the quiet sounds of family life, the aroma of dinner cooking in the kitchen, the muffled laughter of grandchildren running through the halls. Henry, my Henry, remained a steadfast presence, or so I thought. It was only in the small, imperceptible ways that I began to notice him drifting. A whispered phone call late at night, a hastily concealed letter, a subtle tension in his voice when I entered the room unexpectedly. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, we were old now. What could he possibly be hiding? What folly had I allowed to creep into my mind? But deep inside, a whisper of doubt took root, growing quietly, persistently, until it became impossible to ignore. Even now I remember the first time I truly felt the pang of suspicion. I had been organizing old photo albums, dust motes floating lazily in the golden sunlight, when I found a small envelope tucked away behind a frame. It bore no return address, no name, just his initials scribbled in an unfamiliar hand. My heart skipped a beat, an uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. I shook it off, telling myself it was nothing, a forgotten note from long ago. But the seed had been planted, and so began the slow unraveling of my certainty, the painstaking examination of a life I thought I knew. I began to notice the inconsistencies, the subtle shifts in his behavior, a glance that lingered too long on something or someone I could not see. A hushed conversation on the phone abruptly ended when I entered the room. Small things, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, but to me they were screaming warnings I could no longer ignore. I wrestled with these thoughts for months. I questioned my sanity, my memory, my perceptions. Was I overreacting? Was it the weight of age that made me see shadows where there were none? Perhaps, but my intuition, honed over decades of living, insisted otherwise. Something was amiss, and the truth, when it finally revealed itself, would strike me with the force of a tempest I never saw coming. In these quiet mornings, as I sit with my memories, I often reflect on the paradox of time. Time is both a gift and a thief. It grants us wisdom, patience, the ability to see life with clarity, but it also steals innocence, love, and the certainty we cling to so desperately. I have learned in my 70 years that life does not offer guarantees. Even the most devoted hearts can falter. Even the truest love can be betrayed. Yet I am not here merely to lament. This is not a tale of despair, though the pain I endured was profound. This is a story of awakening, of finding strength when the world seemed to crumble around me. It is about the resilience of the human spirit, the courage to confront betrayal, and the determination to reclaim a life that was threatened by deception. I remember the day I decided I would no longer live in doubt. I was sitting in the garden, watching the roses bloom. The irony of my surname was not lost on me, when a wave of clarity washed over me. I realized that I deserved truth, that I deserved justice, that I could not allow years of loyalty to be discarded so easily. I would face him. I would uncover every secret, confront every lie, and in doing so, reclaim the dignity and power that betrayal sought to strip from me. And so, my story begins here in the quiet of my home, with the sunlight painting memories across the floor, with the creaking of the rocking chair marking the passage of years, and with the unwavering resolve of a woman who will no longer be deceived. I am Mrs. Rose, and this is the tale of the life I thought I knew, the betrayal that shook me to my core, and the journey that led me to justice at last. I remember the morning I first sensed something was wrong. The birds outside sang their usual tunes, the sky was painted in soft shades of lavender and gold, and yet an uneasy silence had settled inside our home. It was the kind of quiet that makes you notice the smallest details, the ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, and, more disturbingly, the absence of familiar sounds. Henry, my husband of 52 years, had always been punctual. The creak of his slippers across the hallway, the shuffle of papers on his desk, the low murmur of his voice as he read the morning news. These were the rhythms of our life together. And that morning, they were missing. I found the first clue quite by accident. Our home, cluttered with decades of memories, had drawers and cupboards filled with letters, photographs, and keepsakes. It was in one such drawer, tucked behind a stack of old bills, that I discovered a small folded note. At first glance it seemed harmless, a scribble of words I didn't recognize, a casual message perhaps meant for someone else. But my intuition, sharpened by the many years of observing Henry's habits, whispered that this was different. The note was brief, almost perfunctory, yet every word carried a hidden weight. It wasn't signed in his handwriting, yet it referenced meetings, times, and locations that only he would know. I tucked it away, pretending not to notice it. I told myself I was overthinking, that the imagination of an old woman sometimes conjures shadows that aren't there. But a seed of doubt had been planted, and once planted, seeds are difficult to ignore. Over the following weeks, I began noticing patterns, tiny discrepancies in Henry's routines, subtle changes in his behavior. He would come home later than usual, claiming work obligations that were never verified. The scent of unfamiliar cologne lingered faintly on his coat. I found myself listening to the soft cadence of his voice on the phone, catching glimpses of hushed conversations abruptly ended whenever I entered the room. I began to catalog these clues in my mind, each one a piece of a puzzle I did not yet fully understand. There were mornings when I would wake to find his side of the bed neatly made, his pillow fluffed in a manner that suggested he had left hours earlier than he claimed. His excuses, once believable, now carried an undertone of nervousness, a desperation that did not exist in the man I had known for decades. One particular evening stands out with painful clarity. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes while the sky outside darkened to a deep, bruised purple. Henry had excused himself to run errands, though it was unusually late. Moments later, I overheard a faint whisper, a voice not his, a female voice, delicate yet unmistakably intimate. My hands froze on the soapy dishes, water dripping silently, and I strained to hear. The conversation was too quiet to decipher, but the intimacy in the tone, the hidden laughter, the unguarded softness, it all shattered a part of me I didn't know was still whole. I confronted myself with the question I had been avoiding. Could Henry truly be betraying me after all these years? The thought felt absurd, grotesque even. How could a man so devoted, so intertwined with my every memory, betray the life we had built together? And yet every small clue, every subtle inconsistency, pointed toward a truth I was terrified to admit. I became an observer in my own home, watching the man I had loved for more than half a century with eyes that were suddenly untrusting. I studied the way he answered the phone, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his gaze would flicker when he thought I wasn't looking. I catalogued every detail, every inconsistency, until the walls themselves seemed to echo with the secrets Henry kept. Even in moments of doubt, I clung to memories of our past, our laughter, our arguments, our quiet nights reading together by the fire. How could someone capable of such devotion also harbor deceit? My mind oscillated between disbelief and certainty, hope and despair, until the weight of suspicion became impossible to bear. And then came the small, seemingly insignificant event that tipped the balance, a forgotten receipt tucked between pages of a book on his nightstand. The date was recent, the location an upscale cafe downtown, one Henry never mentioned frequenting. I held the receipt in my trembling hands, the ink smudged by my sweat, and for the first time I allowed myself to truly imagine what it might mean. My heart pounded with a mix of fear and fury, and I realized that ignoring the signs was no longer an option. I resolved in that moment to uncover the truth. I would not allow myself to be deceived any longer, not at my age, not after a lifetime of loyalty and love. The journey ahead would be painful, filled with revelations I could scarcely imagine, but I knew one thing: I would face it with courage. I would confront the betrayal, and I would seek justice in whatever form it might take. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling that had once seemed so comforting, I felt a transformation stirring within me. The Mrs. Rose who had quietly accepted life's routines was gone, replaced by a woman sharpened by suspicion, hardened by experience, and driven by the need for truth. The journey of betrayal had begun, and there would be no turning back. And so, my dear audience, this is where the tale truly begins, not with the discovery of the act itself, but with the subtle, almost imperceptible clues that hint at a world of deception hiding behind the familiar facade of love. Each small hint, each whispered lie, brought me closer to a revelation that would change my life forever. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind where the world outside feels muted and gray, and even the sun seems reluctant to shine. The kind of day that makes memories feel heavier, more vivid. I remember sitting by the window in our living room, knitting something I no longer even needed, my hands moving out of habit while my mind raced in 1,000 directions. My heart was on edge, a tight, anxious rhythm that matched the soft patter of raindrops against the glass. I had been piecing together the clues for weeks, each one sharpening the gnawing suspicion that Henry was not the man I thought I knew. Every slip, every whispered conversation, Every late night had built an invisible tapestry of deceit, and now it was a matter of time before the threads unraveled entirely. That afternoon, I heard the familiar sound of his car pulling into the driveway, but something was off. An unusual silence lingered in the air, and his footsteps were lighter than usual. I pretended not to notice as I continued my knitting, my eyes casually following him through the window. Then came the sound that made my chest tighten, a soft laugh, not his, delicate and airy, mingling with his voice in a tone so intimate it stole my breath. I dropped my knitting, my hands shook. The voice was unmistakably female. My mind raced. How long had this been happening? How many mornings, how many nights had I unknowingly shared my life with a man who had been living a double existence? I crept through the hallway, careful to make no sound, every nerve in my body alert. The laughter grew louder as I approached the study, the door slightly ajar. And there he was, Henry, the man I had loved, my companion for over 5 decades, speaking softly to a woman whose presence in our home shattered every illusion I had clung to. The room was dim, lit only by the gray light filtering through the rain-streaked window. The woman was seated on the edge of the armchair, leaning toward him as they spoke in hushed tones. She was younger, vivacious in a way that made my heart ache with envy and sorrow, her smile bright and familiar to him, the way mine once had been. Henry's face, normally so warm and reassuring, was tense, caught between the thrill of deception and the guilt that flickered briefly in his eyes when he thought I wasn't watching. I felt a strange mixture of disbelief and fury. I wanted to scream, to run in and demand answers, but something inside me froze. It was as if the years of love, of shared life, of unspoken understanding had all come to a sudden, sharp halt. Every memory I had of him was being rewritten in that moment, stained with betrayal. And then I saw it, the subtle gestures I had noticed over the past weeks, the avoidance of my gaze, the lingering touches, the whispered phone calls, all explained, all undeniable. I was no longer imagining shadows. I was staring into the heart of a truth I had dreaded. I stepped back, my breath shallow, my mind a whirlwind of emotions, anger, sorrow, disbelief, and an aching hurt that seemed to pierce through every layer of my being. I had loved Henry with a loyalty that spanned decades, a devotion that required sacrifices both small and large, and yet here he was, betraying the life we had built together with a smile, and whispered promises meant for another. For a moment I considered confronting him then and there, but the years had taught me patience, strategy, and the power of silence. I needed to process, to understand, to gather the strength to face him on my own terms. The revelation had arrived not with a bang, but with a quiet devastation, a knowledge that would haunt every corner of my home and every memory I had cherished. I retreated to my chair by the window, letting the rain fall around me, washing the world in gray, as if nature itself mourned with me. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within, and I realized that this was the beginning of a long journey, not just of betrayal, but of reclaiming my dignity, my power, and the justice I so deserved. That afternoon, I understood something fundamental. Age does not grant immunity to heartbreak, and longevity in love does not guarantee loyalty. The heart, no matter how seasoned, remains vulnerable to deceit, and even the strongest bonds can fray in silence. But within that pain, I felt the first spark of resolve. I would confront this. Betrayal, not as the woman Henry had underestimated, but as Mrs. Rose, resilient, wise, and unyielding. As the rain tapped softly against the panes, I whispered to myself, a vow carried on the gray winds. This is not the end. It is the beginning of my reckoning. And so, dear audience, this is the moment that defines the heart of my story, the point where love and loyalty collide with betrayal, and where the journey toward justice, self-discovery, and truth truly begins. The days that followed my discovery felt surreal, as though I had been transported into a world where nothing was as it seemed. The home I had known for decades, the walls echoing with memories of laughter, love, and shared secrets, now felt alien, each corner hiding whispers of betrayal. I moved through it like a ghost, observing silently, pretending to maintain the facade of normalcy while my mind was a storm of plotting and questions. I had always been a patient woman, one who measured words, actions, and intentions before revealing her emotions. Now, that patience became my weapon. I needed proof, undeniable proof, not only for my own clarity, but to wield with precision when the time came. I would not confront Henry in a moment of blind fury. I would dismantle the layers of his deception carefully, silently, and with calculated grace. My days took on a new rhythm. I followed his subtle patterns, the late trips to the store that now seemed suspicious, the soft hum of his phone vibrating on the bedside table, the hurried whispering conversations that ceased whenever I entered the room. I watched from my favorite chair by the window, knitting abandoned once more, my eyes sharper than they had ever been. I became a silent observer of the man I had loved, the man who now lived a life apart from mine. I started documenting everything, little notes in a leather-bound journal, dates, times, strange coincidences, names, snippets of conversation. I recorded phone messages and emails, always careful to hide my intentions behind casual curiosity. I learned to navigate the digital trails, the receipts, the unnoticed footprints of an affair. Each discovery was like a piece of a puzzle that, when assembled, would reveal the full, undeniable picture. But this was not just about evidence. It was about understanding. I needed to comprehend how a man I had trusted for over 50 years could betray me so completely. What had drawn him to her? How could he so casually disregard the life we had built together? The answers did not come easily. Some nights I sat alone in the darkness, staring at the rain-streaked windows, wondering if love was ever truly unconditional, or if it was merely a fragile illusion we cling to in our youth and age alike. Yet even in my sorrow, a quiet strength began to grow. I realized that this betrayal, as painful as it was, could not define me. It could not erase the decades of wisdom, resilience, and courage I had accumulated. The affair, in all its sordidness, became my catalyst for transformation. I vowed to approach it with clarity, dignity, and a sense of justice that went beyond revenge. I began to craft a strategy, not out of malice, but out of necessity. Each day I would gather information discreetly, moving through the house like a shadow, never drawing attention, always observing. I learned to notice the smallest of details, the scent of her perfume lingering on his coat, the faint indentation of lipstick on a glass, the subtle tension in his voice when speaking to me. These fragments, seemingly insignificant, were the threads I would later weave into a tapestry of truth. One evening, I discovered the most damning piece yet, a series of letters hidden carefully in the back of his desk drawer, written in a hand that was not mine. The words, filled with intimate affection and whispered promises, were a betrayal too deep for tears alone to cleanse. I held the letters in trembling hands, feeling both the weight of his deceit and the power of the knowledge I now possessed. This was no fleeting lapse or moment of weakness. It was a pattern, deliberate and calculated. With each revelation, my resolve solidified. I would not be the woman who sat quietly while her life was undermined. I would confront him, but not impulsively. I would demand truth, transparency, and justice. And I would emerge from this storm not broken but stronger, an embodiment of resilience that no betrayal could diminish. Evenings became my planning hours. By the soft glow of the lamp, I charted timelines, noted suspicious activities, and prepared for the inevitable confrontation. I knew it would be painful, that it would challenge the very core of our decades-long bond. But I also knew that silence would be my undoing, and that justice, in whatever form it took, required courage and careful deliberation. Through the silent investigation, I discovered more than just Henry's deceit. I discovered my own strength, my unwavering capacity for patience, and my ability to navigate treachery with grace. The house, once filled with naive trust, became a battlefield of intellect and strategy, where each move was calculated and each observation meticulously noted. And yet, amidst this strategic pursuit of truth, I allowed myself brief moments of reflection. I remembered our early years, the laughter, the shared dreams, the quiet evenings of comfort. Those memories were not erased by his betrayal. They were reminders of the depth of love I was capable of, and the betrayal only underscored the injustice I was determined to confront. So I waited, silently, methodically, with eyes wide open and heart steeled for the reckoning. And as the days passed, I felt the power of knowledge settle into my bones. Henry's secrets, once hidden, were now mine. And with them came the certainty that when the time came to confront him, I would do so not as the deceived, vulnerable spouse, but as Mrs. Rose, the woman who had endured, observed, and was ready to reclaim her dignity and justice. The moment I had been preparing for, the moment that had consumed my thoughts and every quiet hour of the past weeks, finally arrived. It was not an ambush, nor a reckless outburst fueled by emotion. No, this confrontation was carefully orchestrated, each word measured, each gesture deliberate. I had my proof, my evidence, and most importantly, my resolve. I was no longer the betrayed, trembling woman of the first discovery. I was Mrs. Rose, the force behind decades of endurance, now ready to claim justice. Henry entered the room, unsuspecting, his confident smile faltering slightly when he saw the letters spread across the table in front of me. The perfume-laced whispers of another woman lay bare in the crisp envelopes, a visual testament to his deception. I felt no rush of tears, no wails of despair, only a calm, cold determination. "Henry," I began, my voice steady, yet carrying an undercurrent of controlled anger, "we need to talk. About your other life." He froze, and I watched the shift in his demeanor, the hesitation, the sudden defensiveness. I continued, each word precise, cutting through the haze of lies he had spun over years. "I have seen the letters, the messages, the trips you tried to hide. I know everything. I have been patient, silent, observing, but the time for secrets is over." He tried to deflect, to charm, to manipulate, as he always had. "Nora, it's not what you think," he stammered, using my given name as if familiarity could soften the betrayal, but the evidence before us was unassailable. I remained seated, the calm in my posture belying the storm that had raged in my mind for weeks. "I trusted you, Henry. For 50 years I gave you my love, my loyalty, my very life, and yet you chose deception," I said, letting the weight of each word hang in the air. "Do you understand what it means to betray someone at our age? To betray someone who has spent decades nurturing, supporting, and loving you?" He opened his mouth, searching for an excuse, but I raised a hand, silencing him. This was not a space for lies. "Save your words. I have documented everything, every whisper, every lie, every hidden moment. I will not be manipulated, and I will not be gaslit. Your betrayal ends now, not because I am weak, but because I am strong enough to demand truth." Henry slumped into the chair opposite me, the arrogance stripped away, replaced by guilt and fear. He could no longer hide behind charm or familiarity. I watched him squirm under the weight of decades-long deception laid bare in the meticulous records I had kept. It was a moment of reckoning, not for revenge, but for clarity, justice, and dignity. I leaned forward, my hands clasped together, and spoke slowly, deliberately. I have loved you all my life, Henry. But love does not excuse betrayal. I will not continue to live under the shadow of lies. You have a choice now. Confess, face the consequences, or leave. But know this. I am no longer the same woman you once thought you could deceive. I am Mrs. Rose, and I will not be diminished by your selfishness. He finally looked up, eyes glistening with shame. There was no charm, no deflection, only the raw exposure of truth. I never meant for it to go this far, he muttered, his voice barely audible. I shook my head slowly, a quiet sorrow mingling with my strength. Intentions mean nothing without integrity, Henry. You chose your actions. Now you live with them. The room was heavy with silence, thick with the gravity of truth finally spoken. I felt an unfamiliar sense of empowerment, a liberation that came not from the humiliation of another, but from the acknowledgement of my own strength. The confrontation, which I had feared might shatter me, instead became the catalyst for my own reclamation of dignity. I stood, gathering the letters and evidence, each envelope a reminder not of betrayal alone, but of the resilience it had evoked in me. You may have tried to break me, I said softly, yet with iron resolve, but you have only revealed the depth of my courage. From this moment forward, I choose my own path. Justice is mine, not yours to dictate. Henry remained seated, wordless as I left the room, a quiet authority in my steps, the years of pain, patience, and observation converging into a singular force of will. The confrontation was over, but the journey had just begun. I knew the days ahead would require decisions about trust, forgiveness, and the legacy of our life together. Yet for the first time since discovering the affair, I felt unshakably grounded, fully aware that my power lay not in revenge, but in the reclamation of my own story. That night I sat by the window, the familiar hum of the city below, and reflected on the confrontation. I realized that betrayal, no matter how cruel, could not define me. I had faced it, documented it, and confronted it. And in doing so, I discovered a profound truth. My worth, my dignity, and my life were mine to reclaim, not his to diminish. As the moonlight spilled across the room, illuminating the careful lines of my aged face, I whispered to myself, I am Mrs. Rose. I am witness, survivor, and arbiter of my own justice. And from this moment I will live not in shadow, but in the light of my own power. The morning after the confrontation, the house felt impossibly silent. Henry's absence from the breakfast table was more than a physical void. It was the echo of a lifetime of choices finally laid bare. I sat alone, the sunlight filtering through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the worn oak floor. For the first time in decades, I felt the weight of the house, not as a home shared with another, but as a vessel for my own reclaiming. I had spent the better part of my life with Henry, and yet, as I sipped my tea, I realized how little I had truly seen him. Betrayal, I had learned, does not always announce itself with shouting or scandal. It often creeps in through subtle shifts, whispered lies, and the gradual erosion of trust. And now, in the quiet aftermath, I understood something vital. The reckoning was not just his to bear, it was mine to fully embrace. I wandered through the corridors, each room a capsule of memories, laughter frozen in faded photographs, the scent of old perfume lingering like ghosts, and the weight of shared decades pressing gently against my back. And yet, instead of crushing me, these memories became my scaffolding. They reminded me that my life had not been a hollow one. I had loved deeply, nurtured fiercely, and survived with a strength that even betrayal could not undo. By mid-morning, I was in the study, surrounded by notebooks, letters, and photographs I had collected during my investigation. The letters from the other woman, carefully dated and preserved, seemed almost surreal now. It was one thing to know about the affair. It was another to see it meticulously documented, each word a testament to deception, each envelope a silent accusation. I ran my fingers along the edges, feeling the papery weight of truth. I remembered a line from one of my journals written years before, in a moment of youthful reflection. We cannot control the hearts of others, only the strength with which we hold our own. How true it had become. In confronting Henry, I had held my heart firmly, refusing to crumble under the weight of betrayal. And now, as I stared at the evidence, I felt a burgeoning sense of clarity. This was not just about him. It was about the life I would choose from this moment forward. The days that followed were a delicate dance of civility and internal upheaval. I observed Henry with the careful attention of a historian chronicling a fallen empire. He moved through the house with the cautious hesitation of a man who had finally been exposed. His once confident steps were measured, his smiles tentative, and his words, when they came, seemed hollow. It was a revelation that the man I had loved so completely was not only fallible, but also profoundly flawed in ways I had long suspected, but never wished to confront. And yet, amidst the silence and the subtle tension, I found myself grappling with emotions I had not anticipated. Anger, yes, sharp and unforgiving, a blade honed over years of suppressed suspicion, but also sorrow, deep and unexpected, like an ocean tide that rises without warning. I mourned not just the betrayal itself, but the illusion of a shared life I had cherished, the dreams we had once spun together, and the quiet companionship I had imagined would carry me to the twilight of my days. One afternoon, I decided to take a walk in the garden, my favorite retreat since childhood. The roses, carefully tended, bloomed with stubborn resilience, a quiet reminder that life, despite hardship, continues to flourish. I walked slowly along the stone path, the fragrance of jasmine mingling with the damp earth, and I allowed myself to reflect on the magnitude of my journey. I realized that the reckoning was not merely about confronting Henry or exposing his lies. It was about confronting the truths within myself. I had to ask difficult questions. Who was I, if not Henry's wife? What did I truly want in the years that remained to me? And most importantly, could I forgive, not him necessarily, but the circumstances, the human frailty that allowed betrayal to exist in the first place? The answer, I found, was complex. Forgiveness would not be instantaneous, nor would it be absolute. It was a process, a slow and deliberate reclaiming of peace, a recognition that my own heart needed healing more than it needed retribution. And in that recognition, I began to understand the true power of the reckoning. It was not about punishment, but about liberation. Over the next few weeks, I undertook a meticulous transformation of my daily life. I reorganized the house, moving reminders of Henry's duplicity into corners of memory where they could no longer dominate my thoughts. I spent hours in the garden, nurturing life as an act of personal reclamation. Each bloom, each carefully pruned branch became a metaphor for resilience and rebirth. I also reached out to friends I had distanced myself from over the years, reconnecting with voices that reminded me of my own worth. Luncheons with old companions, long phone calls with distant relatives, and quiet afternoons spent with neighbors all became threads in the fabric of a life I was now deliberately weaving for myself. The social life I had once allowed to fade in favor of marital devotion was revived with a newfound energy. Each conversation and shared laughter reinforcing the reality that my world was not confined to Henry's betrayals. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, I sat in my favorite armchair with a notebook on my lap. I began writing, not letters of accusation, but reflections of my own journey, the story of a woman who had been wronged yet refused to be diminished. The words flowed freely, a river of catharsis, capturing the raw truth of my emotions. I wrote of pain, certainly, but also of courage, wisdom, and the indomitable spirit that had carried me through decades of life's trials. It was in this act of storytelling, of chronicling my own experiences, that I felt the deepest sense of reclamation. Henry's betrayal, while deeply wounding, had inadvertently unlocked a reservoir of self-awareness and empowerment I had not known existed. The reckoning, I realized, was not merely an external confrontation. It was an internal awakening, a recognition of the strength I had carried quietly for so many years. As autumn arrived, the garden's colors shifting to golds and deep reds, I felt a profound shift within myself. The house, once heavy with tension, now breathed with life renewed. Henry, aware of the boundaries I had established, moved carefully around the edges of my reclaimed world, and though the past could not be erased, I had learned to navigate the present with grace, dignity, and unwavering resolve. In the quiet hours of the night, I often sat by the window, gazing at the stars, reflecting on the journey of the past months. I realized that life in all its complexity does not offer perfect closure, nor does it guarantee absolution. But it does offer opportunities to reclaim one's dignity, to confront truth with courage, and to embrace the life that remains with deliberate intention. And so I embraced my own narrative fully. I allowed myself to feel the depth of betrayal, the sting of disillusionment, and the pangs of sorrow. But I also allowed myself to feel the power of resilience, the clarity of purpose, and the quiet triumph of self-possession. The reckoning was not a single moment. It was a continuum, a tapestry woven from confrontation, reflection, and deliberate action. I knew as I sat in the dim glow of the lamp that the story of my life would now be defined not by Henry's choices but by my own. I would continue to chronicle, to observe, and to narrate, not as a victim, but as a woman who had faced betrayal, embraced her own strength, and emerged with dignity intact. The reckoning had begun, and it would continue in the days, months, and years to come. But I was ready. I was Mrs. Rose, and I had claimed my own justice, my own peace, and my own life. The first morning after my realization, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The house, though filled with the shadows of past mistakes, seemed to exhale as if acknowledging a new chapter in its long existence. I walked through the room slowly, my footsteps careful, almost ceremonial, as though I were marking the boundaries of a life I would now fully inhabit on my own terms. For decades, I had been Mrs. Rose in name and in habit, but in truth, my identity had been entangled with Henry's, the man who had once been my world, and now represented a fracture I could not ignore. The garden became my sanctuary. I spent hours tending to it as I had in my youth, but now with a deliberate intention that extended beyond mere cultivation of roses. Each bloom, each carefully pruned branch was a testament to resilience. I realized that the garden mirrored my own life, even after years of neglect, of harsh winters, and of storms that threatened to uproot me. There was still growth, still beauty to be nurtured and celebrated. Henry, meanwhile, drifted through the house like a ghost of the man he had once been. He offered apologies, tentative and awkward, but they felt empty, echoing through the walls with the weight of someone who had long lost his place in my life. I listened, nodded occasionally, and allowed him to speak. But I knew that the reconciliation he sought would not come from me. It would have to come from within himself. I began to focus on the legacy I wished to leave behind. For so many years, I had invested my energy in maintaining a household, supporting a partner, and keeping the rhythm of life steady for our family. Now I realized that it was time to invest in something that was purely mine. I started with my journals, pouring my experiences, reflections, and insights into pages that would one day be more than personal catharsis. They would be a testament to endurance, wisdom, and the complexities of love and betrayal. The act of writing became ritualistic. I rose each morning at dawn, poured myself a cup of tea, and sat by the window overlooking the garden. The light, soft and golden, spilled across the pages as I chronicled my journey, capturing not just the moments of pain, but the nuanced emotions, the small triumphs, and the quiet victories that had defined my life. Each sentence was a stitch, weaving together a tapestry that was uniquely mine. In this period of reflection, I also reconnected with friends and neighbors I had long neglected. Luncheons, afternoon teas, and long walks became opportunities to rebuild relationships that had frayed under the weight of marital obligations. I discovered that these connections, once dormant, were sources of immense support and joy. I laughed more freely than I had in years, sharing stories, exchanging advice, and relishing the warmth of companionship that required nothing of me but authenticity. As the weeks passed, I began to think more seriously about my broader legacy. What did I want to leave behind, not just for those I loved, but for the world at large? The answer, I realized, was complex but clear. I wanted to leave a record of a life lived with intention, courage, and integrity. I wanted future generations to understand that even in the face of betrayal, one could reclaim agency, cultivate resilience, and create meaning. I also reflected on the lessons I had learned about love. For so long, I had defined myself by the presence or absence of Henry's affection. Now, I understood that love was not merely a shared experience with another, but a recognition of self-worth and dignity. I began to write essays and letters not just about betrayal, but about the subtle, often overlooked ways in which women, particularly older women, are diminished and silenced. These writings became my mission: to speak for those who could not, to illuminate the complexities of life's later stages, and to celebrate the courage that often goes unnoticed. The more I wrote, the more I realized that my legacy could extend beyond words. I started mentoring younger women in the neighborhood, sharing insights about relationships, personal boundaries, and resilience. I hosted small gatherings where women from diverse backgrounds came together to discuss their experiences, challenges, and triumphs. In these moments, I saw reflections of my younger self, curious, uncertain, yet fiercely determined. I offered guidance not as an authority, but as a companion who had walked similar paths and emerged with hard-earned wisdom. Henry's role in this chapter of my life had shifted. He became at most a cautionary tale rather than a central figure. His actions, while deeply wounding, had inadvertently prompted a profound awakening. I found a strange gratitude in that realization, a recognition that even betrayal can serve as a catalyst for transformation. And while he attempted to reconnect, to salvage remnants of a shared past, I understood that my legacy was not contingent upon his presence. My story, my wisdom, and my life were now self-sustaining. Socially, I became more visible. Invitations to community events, book clubs, and local lectures became more frequent. I shared anecdotes from my life, discussing the intricacies of love, the challenges of aging, and the power of self-reclamation. The audience responded with warmth and curiosity, inspired not just by the events I narrated, but by the authenticity with which I spoke. My story, once private, had evolved into a bridge connecting generations, offering guidance, reflection, and a sense of shared humanity. In the quiet evenings, I would return to the garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of rose and amber. Sometimes Henry would join me, and we would sit in silence, the distance between us now defined by mutual acknowledgement rather than conflict. Other times I was alone, enveloped in the fragrance of the roses, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. Each petal, each bloom, seemed to whisper reminders of resilience, patience, and the beauty of life's enduring cycles. Financially and practically, I took steps to secure my independence. I reviewed accounts, investments, and legal documents, ensuring that my estate reflected my wishes and not the remnants of past deceptions. This process was meticulous, often tedious, but deeply empowering. It was a concrete affirmation that the life I had built, full of care, commitment, and responsibility, would ultimately be my own, safeguarded by both intention and action. Spiritually, I felt a shift as well. Meditation, quiet reflection, and moments of prayer became more than rituals. They were anchors grounding me in the present. I discovered that peace was not simply the absence of conflict, but the active cultivation of understanding, forgiveness, and acceptance. My conversations with the divine, once routine and perfunctory, became intimate dialogues, guiding me in my decisions and providing solace amidst the lingering shadows of betrayal. As autumn deepened into winter, the garden transformed once again. Leaves fell in a brilliant cascade of gold and red, carpeting the paths in a mosaic of fleeting beauty. I saw in this seasonal cycle a metaphor for life. Endings are inevitable, but they pave the way for renewal. The betrayal, the sorrow, and the quiet heartbreak of the past months were, in their own way, the compost from which new growth would emerge. I began to compile my writings into a cohesive narrative, a memoir not just of a life shared with Henry, but of the woman I had always been beneath the surface of marital roles and societal expectations. This project became my most ambitious undertaking yet, a tangible representation of legacy, resilience, and the power of storytelling. Through this process, I discovered that my voice, once muffled by years of accommodation and expectation, had strength, clarity, and resonance. Readers, neighbors, and even distant family members responded with gratitude, inspired by the honesty and courage that permeated each page. My story, while deeply personal, had transcended the boundaries of my own experience, becoming a touchstone for reflection, empowerment, and hope. By spring, the garden was in full bloom once more, vibrant and resilient. I walked among the roses, each petal a reminder of the journey that had brought me here, the pain endured, the wisdom gained, and the legacy forged. Henry, now more of a memory than a companion, had receded into the background of my life, his presence a faint echo rather than a defining force. And so I embraced my legacy fully. I became a storyteller, a mentor, a chronicler of resilience, and a beacon for those navigating the complexities of life's later stages. The house, once heavy with the weight of deception, now resonated with laughter, reflection, and the quiet joy of self-determination. I knew that my story would endure, not because of the betrayals I had suffered, but because of the choices I had made in response. I had reclaimed my identity, cultivated my passions, and ensured that the next chapter of my life would be defined by agency, wisdom, and grace. I was Mrs. Rose, still learning, still growing, and fully alive. My legacy was no longer tied to the past, nor to Henry's actions. It was mine, vibrant and enduring, a testament to the indomitable spirit of a woman who had faced betrayal, embraced her own strength, and emerged with dignity intact. The years had a way of passing that felt both slow and rapid at once. I often found myself sitting by the window, a warm cup of tea in hand, gazing at the garden I had nurtured, like a living memoir. The roses, now more abundant than ever, were a tapestry of color, fragrance, and memory. Each bloom seemed to carry a story, a whisper of the trials, betrayals, and victories that had shaped the tapestry of my life. In these moments I felt a profound sense of completion, not of an ending, but of a full circle, a life that had looped back to its origins, wiser and more whole than ever before. Henry, my husband of nearly 50 years, had faded from the central narrative of my life. His affair, the whispers, the deception, they were scars, yes, but they no longer ached with the same intensity. Instead, they served as markers of my transformation. I had discovered that betrayal, while devastating, could be a catalyst for awakening, for reclamation, and for a deep understanding of self-worth. And so, I allowed him a place in my memories, a chapter that was acknowledged but no longer dictated the story. One spring morning, a letter arrived. Its envelope was creamy, thick, and smelled faintly of lavender. Inside, written in careful handwriting, was a message from a young woman I had never met, a reader, a neighbor, someone who had found my writings through the local library. She spoke of her own struggles with deception, self-doubt, and the challenges of aging in a society that often overlooks older women. She thanked me for sharing my story, for giving voice to experiences she had felt were invisible. I read the letter twice, savoring every word, feeling a connection that spanned generations. It struck me then that my legacy had taken on a life of its own. My journals, essays, and mentorship had become more than a personal catharsis. They were now instruments of influence, sources of guidance, and beacons of hope. I began corresponding with several women, exchanging letters, advice, and reflections. Through these interactions, I realized that my story was not just mine. It was part of a collective narrative of women reclaiming power, dignity, and voice in the later stages of life. The house, once heavy with the tension of deceit, had transformed into a sanctuary. Every corner held memories, yet none held the weight of past betrayal. The living room, bathed in soft morning light, became a space for storytelling, for reflection, and for quiet celebrations of life. Friends, old and new, gathered there often, sharing laughter, debates, and gentle confessions. It was here that I felt the true meaning of family, not necessarily tied to blood or marriage, but to connection, respect, and mutual support. Henry, meanwhile, had become an observer more than a participant. Occasionally, he would sit quietly in the garden, tending to a small section of roses, a silent acknowledgment of his own existence within the world we had built together and apart. Our interactions were civil, measured, and surprisingly peaceful. The anger that had once consumed me had dissipated, replaced by an understanding that some lives intersect for a reason, even if only to teach resilience and self-awareness. One particularly quiet afternoon, I decided to revisit the attic. It was a dusty, seldom-used space, but it held relics of our shared past, photographs, letters, and trinkets collected over decades. I carefully unpacked boxes, allowing memories to surface in waves. There was the photograph of our wedding day, my youthful smile juxtaposed against Henry's confident grin. Letters from my younger self, full of hope, fear, and expectation, reminded me of the journey I had undertaken. Each item, each memory, reinforced a single truth. Life was not about avoiding pain, but about navigating it with courage, grace, and authenticity. During this exploration, I found an old, forgotten journal belonging to Henry. Its pages were filled with reflections, regrets, and admissions he had never voiced aloud. Reading it was bittersweet. It revealed the humanity behind the betrayal, the weaknesses and fears that had led him astray. I did not read it to justify his actions, nor to reopen old wounds. I read it to understand, to contextualize, and ultimately to release the final threads of anger and resentment that had lingered in the corners of my heart. The act of forgiveness, I discovered, was less about him and more about me. It was a conscious decision to free myself from the lingering shadows of bitterness. Forgiveness did not mean forgetting, nor did it mean condoning. It meant reclaiming my own peace, choosing not to be tethered to past pain, and stepping fully into the present with dignity and tact. I carried this lesson into every interaction, every mentorship session, and every journal entry I wrote. As summer arrived, the garden became a reflection of my own vitality. The roses were in full bloom, their colors radiant against the green backdrop. Bees and butterflies danced among the petals, a reminder of the simple joys that life continued to offer. I spent mornings tending to the flowers, afternoons writing, and evenings in the company of friends and neighbors who had become an extended family. The rhythm of my days was deliberate, purposeful, and full of small, meaningful moments that nourished the spirit. It was during one such evening that a local journalist approached me, intrigued by my story of resilience, betrayal, and reclamation. She proposed a feature, highlighting my experiences as a lens through which to explore broader societal themes. The invisibility of older women, the challenges of navigating love and betrayal in later life, and the power of self-reclamation. I agreed, not out of vanity, but as an opportunity to amplify voices that often went unheard. The resulting article sparked conversations, inspired letters from readers, and opened doors to speaking engagements I had never imagined. Through these public interactions, I discovered a new dimension of empowerment. I was no longer defined solely by my personal narrative. I had become a conduit for shared experiences, a storyteller whose voice resonated beyond the confines of my own life. Women approached me for advice, young adults sought guidance on relationships, and even men expressed appreciation for the honesty and perspective I offered. My legacy was no longer a private reflection. It was living, breathing, and evolving in the world around me. Despite the public recognition, my most cherished moments remained intimate and quiet. I found immense satisfaction in the simplicity of my days. The scent of roses in the morning, the laughter of friends during afternoon tea, the satisfaction of a journal page filled with reflections, and the occasional quiet walk with Henry, now companions in coexistence rather than partners in passion. These moments, small and seemingly mundane, held profound significance. They were proof that life's beauty often resides in the subtle, overlooked details. As autumn approached once more, I reflected on the full circle my life had taken, from youthful optimism through betrayal and heartbreak to self-reclamation and legacy building. Every experience had contributed to the woman I had become. I realized that the narrative of my life was no longer dictated by external circumstances or by the actions of others. It was mine, authored by my choices, my resilience, and my unwavering commitment to authenticity and dignity. One crisp evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of rose and amber, I stood in the garden and felt a deep sense of completion. The roses, now a vibrant testament to the cycles of life, seemed to whisper their approval. I had navigated betrayal, reclaimed my agency, and created a legacy that extended beyond the confines of my home. The story I had lived, the wisdom I had gained, and the voices I had amplified formed a tapestry of resilience and empowerment. I knew that the journey was far from over. Life, even in its later stages, continued to offer lessons, joys, and challenges. But I also knew that I had arrived at a place of profound understanding. The true power lies not in revenge, nor in clinging to past hurts, but in embracing one's own story, nurturing one's own growth, and leaving a legacy that inspires and empowers others. and so I remained Mrs. Rose, older, wiser, and fully alive. My narrative had come full circle, not with an ending, but with a culmination of insight, grace, and enduring strength. The house, the garden, the journals, and the relationships I had cultivated were all proof that life, even after betrayal, could be beautiful, purposeful, and deeply meaningful. I looked out over the garden, inhaled the scent of roses, and smiled. The journey had been long, fraught with pain, and yet immeasurably rewarding. I had learned that love, loss, and resilience are not linear, but intertwined, each shaping the contours of a life well lived, and in that realization I found peace, empowerment, and the knowledge that my story would continue through the lives I touched, the wisdom I shared, and the legacy I had built with intention, courage, and grace. The quiet mornings had become my sanctuary. Even in my 70s, the rhythm of life had a gentle persistence that soothed me in ways I had never anticipated. The sun would rise, spilling light across the garden where roses swayed with the wind, and I would take my first sip of tea with deliberate mindfulness. It was in these moments that I felt the weight of time and the richness of experiences converge into a deep sense of gratitude. My journey, from a trusting young woman to a betrayed wife, and finally to a wise, self-assured elder, had left its marks, but it had also given me a wealth no riches could rival, insight, resilience, and a voice that carried across generations. The house, once heavy with the echoes of deceit, now felt alive with memories that were no longer painful but celebratory. Each room told a story. The kitchen held the scent of countless meals prepared with love. The living room echoed laughter shared with friends, and the attic, once dusty and neglected, now housed relics of my growth, photographs, letters, and journals that chronicled decades of reflection. I often wandered through these spaces slowly, savoring the quiet testimony of a life that had been both tumultuous and rewarding. Henry, my husband, had receded into the background of my narrative. The man I had once loved and the man who had hurt me were now fused into a singular figure of past experience. Occasionally he would sit beside me in the garden, tending to roses with a careful hand, his presence a reminder that some lives intersect for reasons beyond our understanding. Our conversations were polite, measured, and surprisingly devoid of tension. I no longer sought his approval, nor did I harbor resentment. I simply acknowledged him as part of the tapestry of my life. The greatest joy of this chapter of life, however, was the connections I had cultivated outside the confines of marriage. I had become a mentor, a storyteller, and a confidant to countless women who sought guidance and affirmation. Through letters, emails, and in-person conversations, I shared the wisdom I had accrued, the lessons learned from betrayal, the strategies for self-reclamation, and the importance of embracing one's own narrative with courage. These interactions were transformative for both sides. As much as I offered guidance, I also received insights from the younger generation, whose perspectives were vibrant and refreshing. One particular letter stands out in my memory. It was from a woman named Emily, a school teacher in her 40s, who had stumbled upon my writings in a local library. She recounted her struggles with a marriage strained by infidelity, her doubts about self-worth, and her fears about aging alone. She wrote of how my story gave her hope, inspired her to set boundaries, and encouraged her to prioritize her own growth. As I read her words, I felt a profound connection that transcended time and space. In that moment, I realized that my legacy was no longer confined to my personal experience. It was now living in the hearts and minds of others. The garden became a classroom of sorts. I often invited women over, encouraging them to sit among the roses, journal in hand, and reflect on their own journeys. We shared stories of loss, triumph, love, and disappointment, creating a tapestry of communal wisdom that I had never imagined possible in my youth. The laughter, the tears, and the quiet moments of contemplation became the heartbeat of my days, each interaction reinforcing the importance of shared human experience. As autumn painted the leaves in hues of gold and amber, I began to contemplate the idea of permanence. What would remain of me when I was no longer here? The answer was not in wealth, possessions, or even the fleeting recognition of others. It was in the lives I had touched, the minds I had inspired, and the hearts I had comforted. Legacy, I understood, was a living, breathing entity, not something to be stored in a box or etched in stone, but something nurtured through action, presence, and intention. In quiet reflection, I began to compile my journals and essays into a cohesive manuscript, a memoir not merely of betrayal and heartbreak, but of resilience, self-discovery, and empowerment. I wrote with the honesty of one who had loved deeply, been hurt profoundly, and emerged with a clarity that only time could bestow. The act of writing became both cathartic and purposeful, a final offering to the world that had given me both trials and triumphs. One evening, while sitting by the fireplace, I recalled a pivotal moment from decades ago, the discovery of Henry's affair. I had once felt as though the walls of my life had crumbled around me, as though betrayal had rendered me powerless. But now, in the warm glow of the fire, I understood that those moments had been crucibles shaping the woman I had become. The pain had been temporary, but the lessons were eternal. It was a truth I now shared freely with anyone who would listen. Life's challenges, no matter how devastating, could be transformed into catalysts for growth and empowerment. As winter approached, the garden lay dormant, but the house was alive with memories and plans for the future. I began to organize community gatherings, workshops, and writing circles, ensuring that the wisdom I had gathered would continue to circulate and inspire. Younger women sought advice on navigating complex relationships, self-care, and personal growth. Older women shared reflections on the joys and struggles of later life. Together, we formed a network of resilience and empowerment that transcended age, geography, and circumstance. Henry, ever present yet unobtrusive, occasionally asked questions about the events of my past, seeking understanding, though perhaps not entirely aware of the depth of the transformation I had undergone. I answered with measured honesty, offering insight without indulgence. It was a delicate balance, acknowledging the past without allowing it to dominate the present, a skill I had honed through decades of reflection and conscious choice. Through these experiences, I realized that justice in its truest form was not always external or punitive. It was found in reclamation, in self-assertion, and in the cultivation of a life that reflected one's values and integrity. I had once sought retribution, imagined scenarios of confrontation, and wrestled with bitterness. Now I understood that the most profound justice was internal, the ability to rise above pain, embrace one's own narrative, and live fully, despite the shadows of betrayal. Spring returned once more, a reminder of renewal and cyclical wisdom. I walked through the garden, noticing the blooms that had returned with renewed vigor. Each flower seemed to whisper a story of resilience, echoing the journey I had undertaken. I felt a deep sense of alignment, as if the universe itself was affirming the choices I had made, the lessons I had learned, and the legacy I was leaving behind. In the evenings I would sit by the window, journal in hand, reflecting on the tapestry of my life. I recorded thoughts, memories, and advice for those who might one day read these words. I wrote of love, heartbreak, resilience, and the enduring power of self-belief. I wrote of the importance of recognizing one's own worth, of cultivating meaningful relationships, and of embracing each stage of life with intentionality and grace. Looking back, I saw that the narrative of my life had shifted from one of external validation to internal mastery. The betrayals, the heartbreaks, and the disappointments were no longer the defining moments. They were chapters, each contributing to the larger story of empowerment, insight, and legacy. I had become the author of my own fate, the curator of my own memories, and the architect of my enduring influence. As I closed my journal one evening, a profound calm settled over me. I had lived a life rich in experience, depth, and connection. The roses outside my window, vibrant and enduring, reflected the beauty of a life fully embraced. I understood with clarity and serenity that the culmination of my journey was not marked by vengeance or regret, but by the quiet, powerful act of living authentically, imparting wisdom, and nurturing the lives of others. I was Mrs. Rose, older, wiser, and at peace. My legacy was not merely a record of the past, it was a living, evolving force that would continue to inspire, guide, and uplift. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in a soft golden light, I smiled, knowing that the story of my life, with all its twists, turns, and triumphs, would endure far beyond my own presence in this world. The first light of dawn crept gently through the curtains, casting a warm, amber glow across my study. At 75, I had come to appreciate mornings not for their promise of action, but for their quiet assurance of presence. I sat in my favorite armchair, worn but faithful, and held my journal on my lap. Each page was a testament to decades of love, betrayal, growth, and redemption, a chronicle of a life lived fully, yet tempered by wisdom. I traced my fingers over the lines I had written, recalling moments of anguish and triumph, and felt a soft swell of pride. The woman I had been, trusting, naive, and hopeful, was no longer alive in the present. In her place stood a woman forged by trials, strengthened by heartbreak, and illuminated by self-awareness. Every scar had its story, every tear its lesson. I had learned the profound truth that life, no matter how cruel at times, could also be tender, sustaining, and transformative. Henry, my husband of over 50 years, sat quietly in the adjacent room. Time had slowed him, softened the sharp edges of his arrogance, and dulled the impulsive desires that once had torn our marriage apart. Occasionally, I would hear him moving about, shuffling papers or tending to his small collection of books. Yet in these years, our relationship had transformed from passion and betrayal to coexistence and cautious respect. He was part of my history, no longer the center of my narrative. I had long ago reclaimed the power of my story, and he existed as a minor character in the grand tapestry of my life. The world outside was awakening. Birds chirped in the garden, the wind rustled through the rose bushes I had cultivated for decades, and neighbors began their daily routines. I felt a gentle connection to all of it, a reminder that life's continuity extended far beyond individual trials or triumphs. The universe had a rhythm, and I had learned to move with it rather than against it. It was in this spirit of alignment and closure that I decided to host a gathering, an afternoon of reflection and celebration for the women who had become my companions, students, and confidants. They were of all ages, some navigating early heartbreak, others confronting the challenges of middle age, and a few who, like me, were approaching the twilight years with both grace and apprehension. Each had sought guidance at some point, and each had contributed to the mosaic of my understanding. As they arrived, the house hummed with life and conversation. I guided them to the garden, where the roses bloomed in defiance of time, their colors vivid against the soft greenery. We sat in a circle, and I shared my story, not with the aim of eliciting sympathy, but to illuminate the path of resilience and self-determination. I spoke of betrayal, of grief, and of the crushing weight of discovering infidelity late in life. But more importantly, I spoke of reclamation, of the quiet power of inner justice, and of the unshakable strength that comes from embracing one's own worth. One young woman, her eyes glistening with tears, reached across the circle to take my hand. "You've given me hope," she whispered. "I didn't think I could ever heal, but listening to you, it feels possible." I smiled, the warmth of connection enveloping me. It was a feeling far richer than any romantic love I had once sought. In that moment, I understood that empowerment was not merely about independence or success. It was about the ability to transform one's pain into purpose, to elevate oneself and others through shared experience. After the gathering, I retreated to my study, a cup of tea warming my hands. I reflected on the decades I had lived, on the choices I had made, and on the unyielding truth that life's greatest victories were often quiet, unseen, and internal. I had once sought justice through confrontation and anger, imagining scenes of reckoning and reprisal, but now I recognized that true justice lay not in external validation, but in self-mastery, clarity, and peace of mind. I picked up a photograph of my younger self, taken shortly after Henry's betrayal. The woman in the picture looked fragile, uncertain, and betrayed. I allowed myself a small, compassionate smile. She had been brave enough to survive heartbreak, to confront deception, and ultimately to reclaim her life. She had paved the way for the woman I had become, strong, discerning, and unapologetically authentic. The seasons continued their eternal cycle. Winter gave way to spring, spring to summer, and so on. In each passing year, I cultivated deeper understanding, joy, and connection. I mentored countless women, wrote tirelessly, and nurtured the spaces around me, both physical and emotional. The roses in the garden flourished, just as the wisdom I shared with others blossomed into lives of renewed confidence and purpose. Even Henry, with his quiet presence, seemed to absorb the shift. Our interactions were polite, occasionally warm, and entirely devoid of the bitterness that had once dominated our household. I had forgiven him, not for his sake, but for my own. Forgiveness, I had discovered, was not a surrender to wrongdoing. It was an act of liberation, freeing one from the chains of resentment and allowing space for growth, reflection, and grace. As twilight descended, painting the sky with hues of lavender and rose, I stood in the garden, the soft wind caressing my face. I felt the culmination of decades of experience, triumphs, and trials converge into a profound sense of fulfillment. My life, with all its twists, turns, and challenges, had led me to this moment of clarity. I was Mrs. Rose, older, wiser, and entirely at peace. I spoke softly to the empty garden, as if addressing the universe itself. I have lived. I have loved. I have been hurt. I have risen. And in all of it, I have found myself. May the lessons I leave behind guide others to strength, courage, and justice within themselves. And with that, I walked back to the house, the roses swaying in gentle agreement, the light fading softly, and the knowledge settling within me. Life had delivered its lessons, I had embraced them fully, and I had finally found my ultimate empowerment,